Ready, Brad? Ready, Bruce? All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Skeptic Society Sunday Lecture Series here, and hello to the watching audience from live streaming. Hi, everybody. Michael Shermer, the director of the Society, the publisher of this Skeptic Magazine, the latest issue on terrorism. You can get this issue today by joining the Skeptic Society. Instead of $30, it's $25 today, and you get the latest issue. We are skeptical of terrorism, not that it doesn't exist. It exists, of course, but that it is the existential threat we are told it is supposed to be compared to other threats in life. It's really not. Anyway, you can read these terrific articles that we have on that and pick up your issue today. So this is part of our ongoing series. We have a couple more left in this spring. In 2 weeks from today, we have Beth Shapiro's lecture on cloning mammoths. That is, bringing back extinct species. You just take some of their DNA, you mix some of it with closely related species that's still existing, like elephants, I guess, and then you bring them back and you turn them loose in Canada or someplace where they can run around and destroy everything up there. Well, at any rate, and not just that, maybe the passenger pigeons, maybe the dodo birds, things like that could be brought back. Of course, it's good to save the current species that are possibly going extinct, but it's not an either-or choice. You can do both. So Beth will be talking about the science behind that. And then 2 weeks after that, on May 17th, we have Leonard Mlodinow's new book. Len is you've heard him a couple of times for us speak on The Grand Design, the book he wrote with Stephen Hawking on does the universe need a universe creator, or can it create itself? And as they showed, it can create itself. He did a co-authored book with Deepak Chopra, The War of the World Views. They don't agree, so that's why it's a war of worldviews. And then he did the Drunkard's Walk on probabilities and randomness and statistics. And so his new book is a little bit of history of science, a little history of humanity, and in general, what makes us different because of science and technology. And then the last weekend of May 29 and 30th, is the Skeptic Society Conference. Will be in the big round white building across the way, Beckman Auditorium, in which we have an all-day, Friday night dinner party, all-day talks on big science, big history, and the far future of humanity. Friday night at the West End is our host hotel. We have a dinner party with all the speakers will be there. You can mingle around and hang out with them and talk to them and get your book signed and in general just have a good time. And then we have talks all day on Saturday. We have Lawrence Krauss and Jared Diamond will be talking about big history, the collapse of civilizations, the biggest threats facing civilization today. David Brin and Greg Benford are both physicists and science fiction writers who will be talking about the far future of space exploration and colonizing other planets and what that means for us. And Esther Dyson is working on she's a computer expert but is also working on ending poverty everywhere by actual experiments with little villages and communities and what you can do to work with them to get them out of poverty, mostly in Africa. Ian Morris talking about energy consumption in civilizations. Our own Donald Prothero will be lecturing on the future of the environment and our interactions with it. And I thought we should do something on the future of religion, since it comes up a lot. And as our speaker today will be talking about, there are some dramatic changing trends in that direction. So I thought, who could I get that has something interesting to say about religion? And that face is just priceless. Of how do you think he feels about religion? And so you can pick up. We have these little postcards here. If you haven't signed up already, just a little information here. You can go on skeptic.com. You can sign up today. And it's filling up fast. It's going to be a great, epic weekend. And then also Sunday, May 3rd, our live streamer here, Bruce, who runs the Orange County Free Thought Alliance, is putting on his own conference all day Sunday, May 3rd in Fullerton, California. So if you're interested in going to that, he always has interesting speakers and like-minded free thought and humanists and so on. You can talk to Bruce afterwards. And I'll come back to our speaker today. But we also have a big trip coming up. We put on these geo tours, and so our next one is in 2016, so a year from now, a little bit more than a year from now. Being led by Donald Prothero, our paleontologist, geologist, and erstwhile GEO Tour leader. Don, come up and tell us a little bit about this trip.
Thank you, Michael. Yes, I wore my secular shirt here in the honor of our speaker here. Thank you, Riverside Atheist, for giving it to me. So yes, well, not this coming summer, 2015, but a year from this coming summer, 2016. It takes a long time to plan these big international events. As I've been mentioning at the previous meetings, we have the Skeptic Tour of Great Britain coming up. It'll be a bit different from anything else, and certainly you'd ever see on the public market, because it'll be an itinerary you cannot match in any commercial travel. It'll be 16 days plus some ending days on each end in England, Scotland, and Wales. It runs from July 13th to 31st. We'll start in London and end in Glasgow. Apparently it's not a big deal to get a plane flight back from Glasgow to London. It's about the same price as dragging you all the way back to London and making a loop tour out of it. And so it includes just about all the basics, all your hotels, all your breakfasts, about 9 lunches, a number of dinners. We'll have, of course, a night in a genuine ancient British castle, a night in a beach resort, our tour guides, our bus drivers, our everything included, basically. And we're going to try to make this a trip of one of a kind, sort of a trip that I sort of cooked up with some other people that you would never find anyone else offer, emphasizing sites are important in the history of skepticism and the history of science, and natural history and geology and paleontology, which are my fields, things you would never find any other commercial tour trying to offer. I don't intend to try to do this twice, so this will be a once-in-a-lifetime trip in a literal sense. So there will be lots of fun places. Of course, Stonehenge is on the trip itinerary. We'll have a cruise on Loch Ness, so bring your binoculars and your cameras. There's a statue of David Hume there in the heart of Edinburgh. We'll talk about the great Scottish Enlightenment with people like Hume and Adam Smith and James Hutton, the founder of geology. We'll pretty much travel almost all across much of Great Britain as you can in about 17 days. And as much as possible, we'll look at geologic sites to show you how Britain came together, and including classic sites like the White Cliffs of Dover down there in the lower right, and the famous unconformity Sicker Point in Scotland, which led Hutton to realize that geologic time is vast and immeasurable. And then I picked this up from some of the other geology tours that are run in that area. There's a number of commercial operations. There's now mostly tours, mines that used to be historically important. So go to a tin mine in Cornwall, where tin used to be their main industry. We'll go to a coal mine in Wales, where my ancestors once mined. And we'll also go to a slate quarry in northern Wales, of course, which was one of their major things. That's Leckwood Caverns up there, which is part of the slate quarry. And then as a person's got hooked on dinosaurs since age 4 and never really grew up, we'll definitely go see many of the sites where paleontology pretty much grew up, especially the places where the first dinosaurs were described and discovered in Britain. Those dinosaurs on the left there are the famous sculptures done in 1851 by Waterhouse Hawkins when they thought Iguanodon was a big clumsy lizard on 4 legs, and they put its thumb spike on his nose and everything. They were done for the Crystal Palace exhibition of 1851. They still stand in Sydenham Park in southeast London right now, so those are interesting places to visit. And we'll also go to Lyme Regis, where Mary Anning, one of the pioneering paleontologists, especially pioneering women paleontologists, found so many important fossils. And you can go there at low tide. We've timed it so we'll hit it at a pretty good low tide and walk there at low tide, and the ground is literally paved with ammonites. It's supposed to be a legendary place. I've seen pictures of it, but I've never done it myself. So that's going to be on one of our stops as well. And then I've been to Darwin's house at Down. There will be a very, very nice tour of Darwin's house, which is really gives us a lot to understanding how Darwin thought and how Darwin lived and how it influenced his thinking. We'll visit sites associated with Alfred Russel Wallace in southern Wales near Swansea, and we'll stop for lunch one day at Isaac Newton's home in Woolsthorpe Manor in Grantham, which is where actually most of his great discoveries were made, because he was avoiding Cambridge because of the plague during the years that he came up with his best ideas, and also the legendary apple tree that supposedly was the source of his inspiration about gravity. And then last but not least, as I said, we'll try to get nice hotels in every place we get, but we managed to snag a castle. So we're going to be in Lumley Castle up in Durham in North England before we head up to Scotland, and so we'll have an overnight in a castle, which includes apparently an Elizabethan banquet dinner. I don't know if you eat your fingers or not, but it should be fun. So anyway, the original plan for the trip was to have one bus. It sold out in the first 3 days after it was announced. So we have a second bus now, and it is already half full. And so if you're interested, I would say do not delay. We will not take a third bus. That's too much. Well, I've got a colleague of mine, a British paleontologist and geologist, who's very good. Will be helping us on the boat between the 2 buses, so we should have enough people to handle both. And I will try to make sure everybody gets to hear everything, no matter which bus you're on. So it'll be a kind of trip I simply can't find it anywhere else. So I hope you'll take your time and take a look at it. There's a flyer over on the stand over there. You can take a look. The itinerary is all there and the details. And then you go to skeptic.com and you'll find the link for it there, and that's where the sign-up is, the PDF. Thank you.
Yeah, be sure and sign up for that. It will fill up pretty quickly here. I just want to say a couple more words before I introduce our speaker today. I just finished up the book tour for Moral Arc yesterday at the LA Times Book Festival, so I thought I'd make a few comments about some current events. It seems like if you just watch the news, the headlines, things are bad and getting worse. How can you say the arc is bending toward justice when there's police shootings and these sorts of things? So I think it's good to remember how far the moral arc is bent, that I claim everyone today, conservatives included, are more liberal than liberals were in the 1950s. You don't see signs like this anymore. And once you start thinking about trend lines instead of headlines, you start noticing little things. Like last Sunday, or I guess maybe was it 2 Sundays ago? Well, anyway, I spoke for the Sunday Assembly that ironically meets on Sundays. This is Janet Kirker's group, and it's sort of a church for atheists, free thinkers, humanists, and so forth. It's a terrific thing. And so they had a live band. They had live music. And they played a sort of a tribute song. They played one of the Beatles songs called It's Getting Better All the Time. Remember the song? You got to admit it's getting better all the time. And then yesterday at the book festival, somebody else brought this up on the panel I was on, that he was talking about two geniuses working together, in this case Lennon and McCartney, that whenever McCartney would come up with one of his super happy schmaltzy, everything's great songs, Lennon would throw in an extra line. Remember what the extra line was? It can't get much worse. But what struck me was, and they were putting the lyrics on the screen, so it's like, oh yes, things are getting better all the time, the moral arc. And then Paul sings, I used to be cruel to my woman, I'd beat her and keep her apart from the things that she loves. Like, whoa, Sir Paul, I mean, would you write that today? That's an example of the sorts of things that, like in the 1950s television series, The Honeymooners, where Jackie Gleason used to joke about hitting his wife to the moon. You know, he's going to hit her so hard, he's going to send her to the moon. Wow. I mean, that's the sort of thing where it shifts ever so gradually, language, how you talk about other people, and that sort of thing. And so here's just a couple things that I've been throwing in, things that you don't see that much anymore. A mother and her son watching a mushroom cloud over their home in Nevada. It's not allowed anymore. Or public executions. Just a great fun Sunday outing. Let's all go out and watch somebody be hanged. The death penalty, well, we're the last country to have the death penalty, which I'm projecting to be, it's on death row. It'll be dead by probably 2025. The way it's going, most inmates on death row die of old age now, except in Texas, a few other states, Ohio, Florida. But other than that, if you take those out, almost nobody's executed anymore. I think the last person in California was in the 90s that was executed. You don't see the KKK at circuses anymore, hanging out in their little uniforms. But more seriously, with the recent police shootings of African Americans, this is bad. And we should be outraged. But it's also good to remember what the kinds of things that used to happen less than a century ago. The last lynching was in the 1950s. And when I was researching lynching for the Moral Arc, I found out that almost half of the lynchings were of Chinese Americans in California. So not just lynchings of blacks in the South, but as I said to my debate opponent this week, Frank Turek in SUNY Stony Brook, since 96% of Americans believe in God, and probably even more in the 20s, how many of these were good, God-fearing, Jesus-loving Christians out for a little fun outing like that? And what happened, by the way, since Christians claim to know what absolute truth is, moral right and wrong, what happened with that? How come they don't do this anymore? Did they get a new revelation from God? Did he come down and go, you know what, this is a bad idea. I've been thinking about this, and here's a new revelation. No. Was there some new scriptural interpretations by theologians? No. The religion shifted along with the rest of us is what happened. And it's good to remember things like violent scenes like the beheading or burning alive journalists by ISIS that it wasn't that long ago, just a few centuries. Here's a 12th century French illuminated Bible of two Jews kneeling about to be beheaded by Christians with Jesus looking on approvingly. This was not that uncommon. Oh, by the way, their crime was killing Jesus. The Jews killed Jesus, which, if you think about it, is an idiotic idea. He had to die to save your sin. First of all, he was Jewish. He was Jewish. Well, what? He killed himself, and then also he had to die to save you from your sins so that you could have eternal life next to God. So they should be thanking the Jews for killing Jesus. And Judas, by the way, should be a hero for turning him in. Okay, this is just an idiotic idea, as is, burning women as heretics and witches. I call that the witch theory of causality, in which we just debunk these idiotic ideas. For example, that Jews poison wells and cause the Black Death, that slaves are better off enslaved than free, that blacks are racially inferior, that women are weak-willed, too weak-willed and emotional to run companies and countries, or that gays want to spread the gay lifestyle. This came up the other day in my debate with this guy. It's like, they want to spread the gay lifestyle. Okay, stop. What does that mean? Well, they want to convert people. Really? You mean like if you met a gay, you think you might switch teams? Well, not me. Okay, all right. It's not a choice, but even if it was a choice, so what? Right? And anyway, his response was, well, if we let gays marry, then what would prevent me from marrying my son? He actually said this. I said, is this something you've been, thinking about doing? And the only reason you're not doing this is because it's against the law? That's it, really? Or my other favorite, people will start marrying their sheep. Really? Where is this a thing? I haven't heard of any stories about people, I really, really, really want to marry Dolly the sheep, and darn it, if it was legal, I'd do it, but I can't, Or that atheists are immoral, or communists, and so on. So this is the kind of thing we're going to talk about today. So with that, let me introduce our guest here. So his book, this is a terrific book and actually a whole program. So Dr. Zuckerman is a professor at Pitzer College. He's the first to innovate a program in secular studies. That is, we are big enough now to warrant college studies on this. The scientific study of who we are. What is it we believe? Who is it that belongs to our group, and how, where are we going? What's the size of our community, and that sort of thing. So he's a sociologist and does secular studies at Pitzer College. In Claremont, his previous books include Faith No More and Society Without God. I guess we kind of know where you stand on these issues with those book titles. And he blogs for Psychology Today and Huffington Post, and so it was in 2011 that he founded this Department of Secular Studies at Pitzer College, the first in the nation to do so. His new book is Living the Secular Life. We'll have a book signing afterwards, and by the way, after that, then we all are going over to El Portal restaurant instead of, Burger Continental is out of business, so we're not going there anymore. They closed their doors after 40 years and retired, so it's an empty building now. So the last time we went to Soup Plantation, and they lack adult beverages and other fun things that you need to solve the world's problems. No, just kidding. And anyway, but we're just trying different restaurants to see where we want to go. It's sort of a social thing that other groups do to kind of bring people together. So after the lecture, we'll all be heading over to El Portal. It's just on Green Street and El Molino, just not far from here at all. So with that, please help me welcome Dr. Phil Zuckerman.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael Shermer. What an honor to be introduced by you. I've been a big fan for a long time, ever since Why People Believe Weird Things, I think. So, can I close? I need a place to set my, I guess, can I? Awesome. Thank you. Great. Oh, and there's water too. Yeah, so thank you for coming on such a, well, I don't have a PowerPoint, such a nice Sunday afternoon. So what a good turnout. I'm impressed. I'm going to talk about secularization mostly today, putting on my sociology hat, but there'll be time for questions and discussion, so we can talk more if you're interested about secular studies and whatnot, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to start with two quick stories. One took place, 25 years ago now, I think, maybe more, in Scotland, and one just took place about 6 weeks ago in Solvang. And so these will be, I met a guy, I was invited to a wedding in Portland, Oregon when I was a young man, and I was somebody's date, and I didn't know a lot of people at the wedding, but at the pre-wedding dinner, this was at a McMinimum's estate outside of Portland, I met other friends of the bride and groom, and there was a whole contingent from Scotland. I think either bride or groom had worked in Scotland at some point. So anyway, I met a guy named Nigel, and we hit it off, and we talked about various things, like being bald. No, just kidding. And I wasn't bald then. Anyway, he was. No. But anyway, and he said we had a good time. This was before email and before cell phones even. So he just said, when if you're ever in Scotland, come and look me up. Here's my phone number. And he scribbled it down. And I thought, well, that's great. I was back into backpacking at the time. So that next summer, myself and a friend, actually Kent, we went to Scotland. We were in England, and then we went up to Scotland, and we got to Edinburgh, and I just literally from the phone at the train station, I just dialed the number, and his wife answered, and he's actually in Oban. He's out with some of his own friends. It was July, they were on holiday, but I'll give you the number there. So I call, Oban's a small town in Scotland, and I reached him, and he said, "Oh, Phil, yeah, I remember you from the wedding. Great, well, I'm with a bunch of my friends. We're camping. Why don't you come and join us?" And we said, "All right, and we'll take the train to Oban." So we took the train to Oban, and got a little bed and breakfast. I didn't want to go camping, and I called him and said, "Well, we're here." And he said, "Great. Well, we'll meet tonight. Oh, I'm looking forward to it." So where do we meet? He's like, "Just meet at the church. We'll just meet at the church at 7 o'clock. I can't wait to see you." Okay, the church. What the big church downtown. You can't miss it. So me and my friend hung out, and we waited. We had something to eat. Whatever. Around 6:45, we started walking through. It's a small town. We started walking through the neighborhood and into the downtown, down by the water, and there's kind of like a central town square. And sure enough, there was the central church of Oban. You couldn't miss it. It was large. It was made of stone. It looked like it had been there for a good 400 or 500 years, and it was pretty grand. And I said, "Well, this must be it." But we couldn't figure out, why are we meeting at the church? We were young. We were in early 20s. We presumed we would be having adult beverages. We wouldn't be going to the soup plantation, and so we thought, well, so me and my friend Kent were trying to figure it out. Like, well, okay, maybe it's some weird Presbyterian religious ritual where you confess your sins before you commit them, and you just sort of get in good with the, And then, they didn't strike me. Nigel hadn't struck me as a religious guy, but you're in Scotland, who knows? And then the other one was, well, we're probably going to be pub crawling, and it would be too hard to know, they didn't know all Oban that well. They were from the big city, so they didn't know where to stay, so they just thought, well, let's just pick a centrally located place. So we assumed that must be it. So we stood on the steps, and there comes Nigel, 5 or 6 of his friends, Hamish and others, and they came, and we all smiles all around, greetings, and then they said, "Well, come on in," and we just stepped aside and just opened up these massive doors, and into the church we went. And both our guesses were wrong. We were not there to repent of any sins, and it was not just a central location. We would be staying in the church all night. The only the fun part was that the church had recently been sold and gutted and turned into a Celtic funk brew pub. So that was it. That was the party central in Oban. Beautiful grand church, still had the crucifixes affixed to the roof of the building, and kind of a Gothic style, large windows, and yet this is the oldest, largest central church in Oban, and it was no longer in business. And it had been secularly repurposed, and there indeed was a Celtic funk band and several bars, no more pews, big tables, no place for a choir but the band, and we stayed there all night and drank and had a great time. So that's, 25 years ago. Now here's the story from Solvang. About a month and a half ago, I was invited to give a talk for some weekend series, the Morgan Stern Far Strip Lecture Series. And on the Friday night, the other speaker was Judith Butler Bass, a professor who studies Christianity. And we were sort of arguing who would go first. And I was not feeling so well, but she had flown in from the East Coast. So that kind of won. It's 12 o'clock midnight for me. All right, you get to go first. So I was going to give roughly this same talk. So I'm sitting there, and she comes up and takes the mic in front of 200 people and says, "I recently went to see a friend in Scotland." And I'm like, she says, And he's a pastor, a priest, a minister in the Scottish, church. And we were going to be discussing the future of Christianity in Scotland. And I said to him, well, what bar will we go to? And he said, oh, forget the bar. We'll just go across the street to the church. And I'm sitting here thinking, oh, man, what the heck? There goes and so that was her opening. I got a huge laugh. And she was like, so do you want to cross? And of course, it wasn't a church. It had been turned into a bar in central Glasgow. And so the two stories, so the first story is, that was my experience seeing secularization face to face in Scotland. But the story 6 weeks ago is just illustration of how typical and common what I experience is. The repurposing of churches throughout Europe has been going on now for 30 years. It's been accelerating every year. So what I experienced in Oban and what Judith Butler Bass recently experienced in Glasgow is not some anomaly. It is the trend. It is the trend. Religion has been fading from British society for quite some time. So, for example, back in the 30s, less than 20% of Scots said that they never attended church. Today, over 60% of Scots say they never attend church. About 100 years ago, 3/5 of all British adults attended church on any given Sunday. Today, fewer than 1/10 are attending church on any given Sunday. Today, over 40% of British men and women say they have no religion. And more than 50% of people in Scotland claim to have no religion. For centuries, the majority of English children were baptized, but today less than 15% are, and only about 5% are attending any kind of Sunday school at all. Indeed, the Church of England now closes about 20 churches a year. Now, back in the 50s, only 2% of British adults, talk about the trends from the moral arc, only about 2% of British adults said that they did not believe in God. Today, over 40% of British adults say that they either do not believe in God or take an agnostic viewpoint, saying that God's existence is impossible to make judgments about one way or the other. As a side note, do you ever see these surveys where people are asked if they're a convinced atheist? And you never see the opposite. Are you a convinced Christian? Are you a convinced theist? It's really funny how these things are stacked against us. Anyway, among younger folks in the UK today, secularity is so pronounced. A 2015 survey that just came out, national poll, found that between 18 and 24-year-olds, nearly half said that they did not believe in any God. So not agnostic, but outright atheistic. Nearly half. It's pretty staggering. Never seen anything like this. This is sociologically and historically unprecedented. And more than half of British people today, in a recent poll, said they now think religion does more harm than good. So these trends, these secularizing trends, show no sign of abating. In the words of sociologists David Voaz and Siobhan McAndrew, writing in the Journal of Contemporary Religion, quote, British society is becoming progressively more secular as each generation emerges and remains less religious than the one before. And my students often ask me, they say, well, isn't it cyclical? Don't these things kind of ebb and flow? No, we have never seen this kind of a loss of religion in history. So that's not to say it may not come back. All Scottish people could be Mormon in 150 years for all we know, or some other new something. But we do not actually have any indicators of societies like this rapidly losing faith in God, just walking away from their religious rituals and traditions to such a degree. It's unseen, so we don't know how it's going to play out. Of course, if we widen our lens and zoom out from Oban, out from Scotland, further beyond the UK, we see a tidal web of secularization that has been washing over the European continent. Wall Street Journal headline from January, a few months ago, quote, Europe's empty churches go on sale. According to this article, 200 churches in Denmark have recently been deemed non-viable, and 700 Protestant churches in Holland are expected to close within the next 4 years, and the numbers are just the same for the Catholic churches there as well. And for the first time in Dutch history, there are now more atheists and agnostics in the Netherlands than believers in God. It's actually gone into the majority. When we consider other nations, right? Sweden, Norway, Germany, France, Belgium, Estonia, Czech Republic, Slovenia, Hungary, Spain, even Austria, we see that on nearly every measure, every indicator, whether it's belief, behavior, or belonging. The arrows are declining. They're heading downward over the course of the last century. So whether we're talking church attendance, belief in God, frequency of prayer, number of baptisms, church weddings, belief in life after death. In fact, Ireland is now leading Europe in having humanist weddings. Ireland was always held out as the most religious of European countries, and yet humanism is exploding there. So how about if we widen our lens even more? Religious participation, religious identification, degrees of faith are fading in Canada. Depending on where you are in Canada, but on average nationally, about 1/3 of Canadians are now atheist or agnostic. It's more concentrated in British Columbia than in Quebec, and yet still nationally 1 in 3. Australia, 1/3 of Australians are now atheist or agnostic, and they recently had an openly out atheist prime minister or president. I can't quite remember. New Zealand, same thing. 1/3 of New Zealanders are now atheist or agnostic, and church attendance in all these 3 nations are at an all-time low. Throughout Asia, nations like Japan, South Korea, rates of irreligion are even higher. For example, 60 years ago, about 70% of Japanese men and women claimed to hold personal religious beliefs. Today, that figure is about 20%. That's some rapid-ass secularization, as we say. And of course, many studies indicate that over half of the Chinese are non-believers. I'm always a little skeptical of the statistics that come out of China on religion due to the communist dictatorship there and their aggressive anti-religious policies. But if the Wynne Gallup polls are to be believed, and I see no reason not, you've got a massive chunk of humanity there claiming to be non-religious. Other nations, however, that we rarely talk about are also secularizing. Jamaica is now at 20% non-religious. 1 in 5. Right? Alabama's at 8%. So, Jamaica is far more secular than many states in our own country. Chile is at 22% secular. Uruguay is the country in Latin America with the highest rates of secularity. 40% of those in Uruguay say they're non-religious. We have never seen this kind of secularization. 9% of Brazilians. Now, you could say, what's 9%? But again, that's beating out Alabama by 1 percentage point. And again, these are all on the rise. Secularity's on the rise everywhere. Oh, the United States, yes. Forgot. The 7th greatest country in the world. Okay, so maybe 8th, depends. Okay, so that's the kind of global picture. This is one of the things that's fascinating us. But the United States, of course, when I was in graduate school at the University of Oregon, there were guys like Rodney Stark, Roger Finke, Lawrence Iannacone. They weren't at the U of O, but that's who we were all reading. And we were taught secularization was this fantasy cooked up by religion haters in Europe who hated religion and at the late 1800s, early 1900s, and they just wanted to see it go away, so they invented this theory that it was going away. But look at the United States, a thriving industrial democracy, a wealthy nation, and it is so religious, so clearly secularization was a fantasy. In fact, some leading sociologists once wrote a chapter in a book called The Religion of Secularization, which I thought was pretty ironic since they're religious, so they're sort of admitting that there's no fucking data. But anyway, so that was Swatos and Cristiano. Anyway, I digress. Sorry to use the F word. We're all adults, I hope. We're having adult beverages later, so then you'll really see me swear. No, just kidding. So what's happening? In fact, since I was in graduate school back in the 90s, we have seen that even the United States, which has always been held up as this counter example to the notion of secularization, is in fact secularizing on all indicators. Just recently, another Wall Street Journal headline, quote, "Fewer churches are going up," referring to the USA. According to this article, for the first time, the construction of religious buildings in America has fallen to its lowest level since such records had started being kept back in the early 1960s. And this is largely the result of more and more Americans losing interest in religious congregations. Back in the 1970s, early 70s, 1972, only 9% of Americans said that they never attend religious services. Now that figure is at 25%. 1 in 4 Americans saying they never attend religious services. The percentage of the rise of the nuns has, of course, been news for quite some time now. I'll just quickly remind you that back in 1990, about 8% of Americans said none, N-O-N-E, when asked what their religion was. In 2001, that was up to 14%, and that made headline news, CNN, et cetera, et cetera. Now it is at a conservative estimate around 22%, and at a more aggressive estimate about 30%. So somewhere between 22 and 30% of adult Americans are now saying they have no religion. And we're seeing, again, the same trend among, even more extreme trend among younger Americans. So for example, the annual American Freshman National Survey found that back in 1971, only 12% of American first-year college students said they had no religion. Today, it's 28% of our first-year classes in America saying they have no religion. And the Pew Forum, again, which is a more conservative estimate, puts it at 33% of 20-somethings are now non-religious, which I have to say is a pretty dramatic flip-flop. About 25 years ago, among 20-somethings, there were evangelicals outnumbered the non-religious by 2 to 1. It has now completely flipped. So among 20-somethings, it's now 2 to 1, non-religious to evangelical. Can I get an amen? No. Okay, so thank you. No, I have no horse in this race. Anyway, and then according to the 2015 General Social Survey recently, it was found that 7.5 million Americans have joined the ranks of the non-religious just since 2012. Now, the vast majority of those who claim to not have a religion, 90% say they're not interested in looking for a religion. They're not shopping. They're perfectly content being non-religious, which is a very powerful statistic because skeptics of these kind of statistics will say, oh, well, you know, people maybe they're looking, maybe they're, you know, just in between churches right now. No. And in fact, according to various surveys, of those who say they are non-religious or say they're none, it's true, not all are atheists or agnostics, but somewhere between a third and a half are. We have that data. We have gone into the NONE population and specifically asked them about their God beliefs. Harris poll has confirmed this. According to Harris polls, they're guesstimating now that somewhere between 25 and 30% of Americans are atheist or agnostic in orientation. People don't like to take the label. You know, so if you ask a person in a survey, are you an atheist, you'll get a very small percentage saying yes. But if you then, even the next question, ask them, do you believe in God? Not sure, I don't know, no, definitely not, maybe yes. The same person that just said no to being an atheist will say, no, I don't believe in God. So people are very happy to express that in their atheistic or agnostic orientation. They just don't like the label per se and for obvious reasons. Okay, now I can relax. Got the data out of the way, some of it. So now, of course, the job for sociologists is not just merely to say what's happening or count numbers. You know, the first great work of sociology was Durkheim's Suicide, where he spends the first part of the book just counting dead bodies, how many people killed themselves here and there. But the reason the book is remarkable is because then he tries to give an explanation of why these suicide rates are the way they are. And that's what made it a work of genius. It's not enough just to say what's going on. We have to try and say why. So prepare for my genius. No, just kidding. So we try to explain these kind of social trends. But of course, I was a little worried they wouldn't allow a sociologist at Caltech. I was kind of looking over my shoulder like, wait, soft science. Okay. Who let that guy in here? It is true in sociology, we unfortunately deal way too much with correlations, which we know are not causation. We do way too much with averages and proportions, and that's the name of the game. It is almost impossible to ever say for sure what causes a massive social trend. There are just too many variables. In fact, I think a sociologist will never win a Nobel Prize because our topic is too complex, not too simple. There are just too many factors: historical, economic, political, demographic, cultural, geographical, culinary, media. It just is so hard. How do we control for these things and prove that X is causing Y? It's very difficult. So really, but we don't stop trying, as Robert Putnam says. We don't just lament the deficiencies of our data, but try to make the best of it as we can. So what I'm going to do here is try to talk through what some of my colleagues and I have tried to speculate as to what's causing this secularization. And sociologists have been doing that for quite a while, right, trying to explain secularization. And ultimately, what we see is there's kind of two approaches. You can try to explain the rise of irreligion by offering a kind of universal or global explanation, or you can stick to a more local or national or case-specific explanation. And in other words, the broader explanations are trying to say, well, if X occurs in a society, it will always result in secularization. It's kind of a universal cause. Like if this happens, if this takes place, if we see this, you will see a decline in religiosity wherever. It doesn't matter if it's Vietnam or Venezuela. Some of us, though, believe that it's similar to religion. You know, religion, you can talk about religion as kind of like one grand thing, and you can try to give some grand explanation for why people are religious. You know, the book I'm reading this morning is about, it has to do with your relationship with your mother between 0 and 3 years old, and that's just, you know, universally explicable. Or there's others who say, you know, you can't really understand Zoroastrianism in Persia in the 12th century, and, you know, in the same way you would study snake handling in Alabama in 1950. You know, there's such a diversity of religiosity in so many times and places that you really have to be case specific. And some people would make that argument about secularization too, that what caused the decline of religion in Japan is not the same thing that has caused the decline of religion in Scandinavia, or the Czech Republic, or Jamaica. That these countries have such diverse histories, such diverse religious traditions, such diverse political trajectories, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I'll tip my hat to the grand universal explanations, and then we'll dive into the sort of country-specific, in this case USA-specific explanations. Most theorists of secularization would say the following, wherever it is, whether it's the Ukraine or Uruguay. Sorry for those alliterations, I'll stop. This is going to cause secularization. So number one, right, increased education in a culture. Both scientific education and, of course, just simply literacy. And I have to say, I felt like, it's been a while since I read it, but I felt like Steven Pinker's has a nice section on kind of the increase of literacy in Europe and all that wrought in terms of expanding people's minds and so on and so forth in contributing to secularization. And we can also speculate that increased access and use of access to and use of technology might increase secularization no matter what, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in the internet, specifically in the United States. Urbanization has always been a favorite, that people come together, which creates pluralism, diversity of worldviews, even a diversity of religious worldviews, which can corrode religious faith. That's, you know, Peter Berger's famous theory from the 1960s. Which, again, religious pluralism is emphasized. If there's just one religion claiming to have the truth and it's all anybody ever knows, it takes on a sort of sacred aura, but suddenly when you have competing religions, it can kind of cause a crisis of credibility for all of them. And then finally, the one that I am most willing to put my bets on comes from Norris and Englehart, right? Sacred and Secular, a great book, where they simply argue, and they have the data to back it, that when life is better for people, economically, existentially, what they call existential security, when people have food and shelter and a decent situation to live in, the government's not corrupt, there's not warfare, when life is generally pretty darn good, and you're not worried about survival, in those types of societies, religiosity tends to plummet. Okay. No matter what, when life gets better for people. And if life is still precarious, religion's going to stay strong. Those are the sort of biggies that people argue about. But what's been going on in the United States? So I'm going to try and walk through quickly, as if I can, the sort of reigning explanations now for what has caused this secular wave to wash over our shores as well, when in fact we used to be considered this great exception to secularization, and now we all know that's not the case. I'm not prioritizing these in any kind of causal order. I think they're all working together. You may have your own theory. I'd be very curious if yours align with mine, if you have another one that you can tell me after the lecture, and I can write about it, and I'll not steal your, no, just kidding. Here we go. So number one, and I'm trying to also offer explanations that people have generated some data on, some evidence, something to back it up as opposed to just pure speculation. Number one, it's argued that the rise of the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, is a backlash against the success and presence of the religious right. Beginning in the 1980s, as you all know, with the rise of such groups as the Moral Majority and the Christian Coalition, the closeness, the overt public love and marriage between conservative republicanism and evangelical Christianity has been so strong and, again, so publicly overt, right? More in the 90s and 2000s, more and more politicians on the right embracing the Christian conservative agenda in ways that were unthinkable in the days of Eisenhower or even Reagan, right? And although it certainly starts, is well under sway in play by then. More and more outspoken Christian conservatives allying themselves with the Republican Party. So you've got, the examples abound, right? From the Michelle Bachmans and the Ann Coulters to the Mike Huckabees. I can't wait till he runs for president. It's going to be fantastic. So wonderful. Who would have thought Gomer Pyle would reemerge as a... Pat Robertson, Rick Santorums, James Dobsons, the Phil Robertson. Thank you for this stuff. So with an emphasis on seeking to make abortion illegal, fighting against gay rights, particularly gay marriage, supporting prayer in school, advocating abstinence-only sex education, opposing stem cell research, curtailing welfare spending, uncritically supporting Israel, opposing gun control, celebrating the war on terrorism, etc., etc., etc. Conservative Christians, of course, have found a warm embrace in the Republican Party. And of course, with George W. Bush, that sort of came to its apex, in a sense, when George W. Bush Jr. was in the Oval Office, and his spiritual advisor was Ted Haggard, was it? The guy who had a thing for crystal meth and male prostitutes in Colorado Springs, who was the president of the American Evangelical Association at the time. So talk about some bedfellows there. So what all this has done, is clearly alienate a lot of Americans from Christianity who were nominally Christian, maybe not extremely active, but maybe so, but who were or are left-leaning politically or even moderate. Sociologists Houghton Fisher up at UC Berkeley have published compelling research in major sociological journals that arguing that the growth of the nuns is largely attributable to this reaction of mixing Christianity and conservative politics, so that a lot of moderate or left-leaning nominal Christians suddenly thought, well, if that's what it means to be Christian, if Sean Hannity and Ann Coulter, she's always wearing her crucifix, and she's saying we need to, kill people as they come up from Mexico or whatnot, then I don't want anything to do with it. I don't want to identify with that. As sociologist Mark Chavez put, quote, after 1990, more people thought that saying you were religious was tantamount to saying you were a conservative Republican. So people who are not Republicans now are more likely to say that they have no religion. Number two, another reaction, this time to the Catholic Church's pedophile priest scandal. As you all know, again, I don't need to rehash this, but for decades, higher-ups in the Catholic Church were reassigning known sexual predators to remote parishes rather than having them arrested and prosecuted. William Lobdell's Losing My Religion has a very powerful story about the lengths to which these higher-ups were reassigning sexual predators. And I'll never forget, just like a year ago, some papers were finally released and made public that the diocese here in Los Angeles was fighting to keep sealed, but finally they were released, and it was found that these guys were sending notes to each other in transliterated Japanese just to try and keep this thing hush-hush. Catholic priests and bishops and so on and so forth. Anyway, the extent of this criminality is hard to exaggerate. So not only were the sexual assaults horrific, but the degree to which those higher-ups, including the last pope, was very much involved, Ratzinger, in these cover-ups. The extent of the criminality is hard to over-exaggerate. Over 6,000 priests have now been credibly implicated in some form of sexual abuse. 500 have been jailed, and more victims have come out than one can possibly imagine. As these crimes became widely publicized, there was a clear secularizing reaction. A lot of Catholics have become ex-Catholics. For example, let's look at the situation in New England. Between 2000 and 2010, so in that one decade, the Catholic Church lost nearly 30% of its members in New Hampshire, over 30% of its members in Maine, and closed nearly 70 parishes, that's 1 in 4, throughout the Boston area. So if you're losing 1 in 4 in Boston, in one decade? My goodness. It's time to sell some of those Michelangelos or whatever you got there in the Vatican. In 1990, 54% of Massachusetts residents identified as Catholic. It was down to 39% in 2008. And according to the American Values Survey from 2012, although nearly 1/3 of Americans were raised Catholic, only about 20% identify as such today, a precipitous nationwide decline indeed. Number one and number two both have to do with religion. and it's malfeasance, bad things going on in the religious realm, so people are reacting. Number 3 is one of these great, wonderful things we find in sociology that no one seems to think of, and yet here it is. And has nothing to do with religion, in a sense. It's not a reaction to religion, it's just a sociological phenomena that seems to have secularized society. Comes from British historian Callum Brown in his wonderful book, The Death of Christian Britain, but it's applicable here in the United States as well. And that is the dramatic increase of women in the paid labor force. As more and more women work outside the home and earn a paycheck, religion seems to plummet. Women, it seems, have historically, but even though men are the leaders of religion and hold all the authority and make all the decisions, women are the ones that seem to actually drive religion in the home. They're more kind of in charge of the religious upbringing of the children, making sure they say their prayers at mealtime or at bedtime, making sure they get up and get to Sunday school. The Simpsons kind of got this one right. You know, Marge is the one always urging the family to church, and Homer is totally disinterested, and the kids would rather not as well, but Marge gets them going. If Marge would stop, the Simpsons would stop going to church. What do we find? Starting in the 1960s, more and more British women started earning an income through paid labor outside the home, and their interest in religion or their time for religion plummeted, and the men and children followed suit. We see a similar pattern in Scandinavia. Denmark and Sweden have the lowest levels of church attendance in the world, and simultaneously, or coincidentally, Danish and Swedish women have the highest rates of outside the home employment in the world among working women. Could just be a coincidence, but I don't think so. So what do we see here in the United States? Back in the 1960s, only 11% of American households relied on a female as their biggest or sole source of income. Today, over 40% of American families are in such a situation where the woman is either the prime or the higher prime breadwinner or the higher earner. Over 40%. How does this work? We don't know that. We don't know. Is it that women just don't have the time anymore and they want to relax on Sundays? Or is it that when you start earning money, you feel a sense of agency, you feel a sense of empowerment, you can make more decisions for your own, and you don't need to rely on prayer anymore? It's hard to say, but clearly there is an effect going on here. Number 4. The greater embracing of homosexual rights. Since the days of Stonewall and Harvey Milk, more and more Americans, of course, have come to accept homosexuality as a normal, legitimate form of love and pairing, as we're also, again, seeing in the moral arc. And we see today that those who continue to malign gays and lesbians, those who oppose their basic human and equal rights, exclusively do so from a religious vantage point. There is no secular anti-gay rights movement or agenda. It doesn't exist. It's unthinkable. And this fact seems to be turning some people off of religion, particularly young people. The fact that Americans today, between the ages of 18 and 30, are the generation most accepting of homosexuals in the country's history and are simultaneously exhibiting the highest rates of secularity, again, could just be a correlation, could just be a coincidence. I'm not so sure. Number 5. Got to give September 11th some causal possibility here. Yes, despite whatever political or nationalistic motivations those hijackers had on 9/11, strong religious belief was a central pillar of what they did. And many Americans took note of that. Yes, 9/11 increased sort of scrutiny of Islam and increased what some people are calling, an irrational hatred of Islam or whatnot, or Islamophobia. And yet, it spilled out beyond that. A lot of people thought, wow, if that's what strong religion can do, maybe strong religion of other kinds is also problematic. And it's not a coincidence, that Sam Harris's book, The End of Faith, was such a huge bestseller after 9/11. People were looking for something to latch onto in the face of that, and it was articulated so, intensely by Sam Harris that was speaking to what a lot of people were thinking. That it's not just Islam, it's theism in general. That's perhaps the problem. Next, I would say, this is more of a cultural level, the Jon Stewarts, the Bill Maher's, the Stephen Colbert's, just irreligious, entertaining, sharp, funny, witty impiety on television. There have been so many successful comedians, and I have a thesis here that you can't be a funny religious person. Like you can't, there's no such thing as like a funny religious comedian. It just doesn't work. I think it was Christopher Hitchens who said something like, religion lacks irony. There's no irony there. I mean, that was one of his central critiques. Like, it just lacks irony. How can you live in how can you have a worldview without irony? And I thought, man, the best comedians are all atheists, right? Lenny Bruce on down. George Carlin. I have heard that Stephen Colbert is a practicing Catholic, but I think he just does it for the wafers. I just don't believe. I mean, if you just, you just have to listen to him, it's like, come on, he knows it's all silly. He's doing it for some other reason. The incense or whatever. What we've seen is extremely successful television shows that our younger generation is eating up. Again, Bill Maher, Stephen Colbert, Jon Stewart among the tops. But you also have to talk about, and these that openly mock religion and its zaniness and its nuttiness. But you've also got South Park, has to be one of the most popular shows that the college students now have grown up on. It's no longer a new show. The Simpsons, House, Family Guy. It's quite possible these have affected the worldviews of a lot of our younger Americans. There's always a debate, right, about how much media influences people's worldviews, but in this case, I'm going to argue that it's having an effect. Number 7, and the last. I already mentioned the sort of emphasis on access to technology and use of technology, so I'm going to focus on the internet. What's interesting about the internet to me is it's just a tool that can be used by anybody. So religious people can use the internet to further their cause, just like secular people can. Why would the internet be any different than, they can use it in the same way, social networking, advertising, whatever it is. And yet, the data keeps coming in, that the internet is not a friend of religion. I don't know why, actually. It's quite this to me is, I'll speculate here, but it seems to be helping the secular side of things way more. Back in the 1980s, as you know, internet usage among the US population was close to 0%. By the early 2000s, over half of the US population was spending at least 2 hours online. And what's interesting, one study from 2014 published in the MIT Technology Review, Alan Downey, argues that internet usage accounts for up to 25% of the drop in religiosity in the past several decades. This happens on several levels. First off, right, and I hear this all the time. I actually do qualitative research myself, so I sit down with people and talk to them, hear their stories. But what you hear over and over again is that religious people look up religion online, often their own religion, for a religious purpose. They want to, what was that fourth commandment again? Or, what was it that Paul said there about, slavery's okay or whatever. Anyway, so are exposed, often unwittingly. You can't look up anything about the Mormons without getting something critical popping right up on YouTube, right? You can't get, and what they're finding is an array of critiques, or if not blatant attacks, on their own religious beliefs, ideologies, the history of their religion. So whether you're a Scientologist or a Catholic or a Jehovah's Witness, whatever, the web is going to expose you to critiques you could have otherwise avoided quite easily in the days of just going to the library. We see direct evidence of this happening more and more. For example, Linda LaScala in her ongoing research, supported by Daniel Dennett, on non-believing clergy, so folks who heard the call when they were young, got jobs as pastors or ministers or rabbis or whatever, but lost their faith and now need to keep their job. So how do you deal with that? Well, what she found is that a lot of them cited the internet. In fact, a lot of them said, I was trying to brush up an old sermon or look up some theological issue that I hadn't revisited since I was in seminary, and then by 2 in the morning, they're scratching their heads. Really, the doubts are just exploding in front of their eyes. But we're hearing this from all over the place. A sociologist, Hella Winston, who studied one of the most secretive, maybe most, what's the word I'm looking for? Private, insular, Hasidic secular group, the Satmars, up somewhere outside of New York, some borough in New York. I'm sorry, I'm from LA. And I thought Yonkers was one of the boroughs. But anyway, she found that this wasn't even what she was looking for. She just wanted to do an ethnographic study of the Satmars, but she actually found some of them kind of living double lives, where they would sort of escape from the neighborhood, cross some bridge into some other part of New York, take off their, outfit from Fiddler on the Roof, and just actually, live a secular life for a while before going home. And what did she find? The internet was crucial. The internet was crucial in them learning about the secular world, being called to the secular world, finding avenues for this. And in fact, it actually is no surprise then that the head rebbes of the Satmar community have sought to ban handheld phones that have access to the internet. It's just too deleterious to having that kind of a worldview. And I just finished last week a wonderful book called The Apostates about ex-Muslims, people who were born and raised Muslim, but in the West, primarily Great Britain and Canada, and how they become, how they lose their faith in Islam and how traumatic the whole process is. And again, what did the researcher find, sociologists from the UK, that over and over and over again, the internet was crucial for all of them. It starts it, it supports it, it's so on and so forth. Also, secondly, the internet allows people who may be harboring private doubts about their religion, of course, to immediately link up with others. Now, you have to imagine an 18-year-old, 15-year-old kid in a Pentecostal home in, Mississippi in, 1982, who everybody's speaking in tongues, everybody's filled with the Holy Spirit, and this 18-year-old or 15-year-old kid's just not feeling it. In fact, kind of thinks like maybe it's just an act, and maybe people are just making stupid noises, and, maybe this isn't so true, and maybe this isn't so true. What is that kid going to do? Right? They live in a small town, their whole family's Pentecostal, the church is everything. Well, they just stand up and say, I have some doubts. And of course now, within 30 seconds, they are finding someone in the same town or in a town over or a county over who feels the exact same way. So it's bolstering secular community. It's bolstering secular identity, community, and so on and so forth. But thirdly, and perhaps most subtly, I think the internet is partly responsible for the rise of secularity simply by what it is. How it functions in our lives now, the interface with our minds and our brains, our desires, our sense of being. The internet is perhaps supplying something psychological or feeding something neurological or establishing something cultural via that individual computer screen nexus, something dynamic that I think is edging out religion's allure, replacing religion's sugar. It's taken away a lot from religion. The entertainment on the internet, the barrage of imagery, the simultaneity, the mental stimulation, the looking and clicking, the hunting and finding, the time wasting, the consumerism, the constant social networking, the virtual communication, I think all of it may be undermining religion's ability to tap our souls. So I want to say a little bit about consequences, both good and bad. And then I thought we could open it up for questions. And I'd like to know if you have any other theories. I am not so sure the rise of secularism is the greatest thing to happen. I, of course, being secular myself, growing up in a secular part of Los Angeles, where I actually didn't know anyone who really believed this stuff until I was 16 years old and started dating the daughter of a preacher, and really was stunned that she claimed to believe what she said she believed. But, obviously I think there's a lot of good news here. And I'll just highlight a few. So first of all, and I don't know why this is, and maybe you can tell me, but wherever secularism is strong, even in the most heinous versions, and by that I'm talking Soviet Union, Pol Pot, Albania under Enver Hoxha. So even either in the most sort of democratic, humane versions of secularism, like we see in UK or Scandinavia or Sunday Assembly, or in the most kind of savage versions of secularism, i.e. Stalin, wherever it is, the status, power, and rights of women improves. It's never equal, but it improves. It gets better. It's fascinating. And I don't know why this is. So I predict that as society becomes more secular, as the United States becomes more secular, this is going to be good news for my daughters and women across the country. I think you're going to see an improvement in the status, rights, and power of women. Wouldn't it be awesome if I could prove that Hillary Clinton is going to win because more people are secular? Next up, this isn't as airtight. There are some exceptions here, Castro's Cuba being the most obvious. But it does seem, on average, for the most part, when religion weakens, the status, rights, and acceptance of homosexuals, gays, and lesbians improves as well. So I am quite certain that as religion loses power, the stigmatization, the oppression of gays and lesbians will weaken as well. So this is all something to celebrate. Third, data shows that secular folks are far more likely to understand and accept the scientific evidence behind global warming and want to do something about it. And the more religious tend to be just the opposite. So we're going to see the degree to which hopefully that will, if it's not too late, I've been told it is too late, but hopefully we'll see a greater and stronger environmental movement in the wake of a decrease in religiosity. And it just goes on from there. There's a host of other social issues where secular people stand out in their moral outlook compared to the religious, which we can talk about more if you want. But finally, I'm not so sure about this because the way secular folks are not organized, are not affiliated with each other, may temper this, but hopefully we will see greater political power for secular Americans, which will strengthen the separation of church and state in this country. And hopefully we'll see a day when politicians think, uh-oh, what will the secular folks think of this? To the same degree that they now say, well, what's the religious right going to say if we do that? That's always keeping them in check, and hopefully we'll see some of them starting to take notice of, oh, wait a minute, what about that 25% of secular Americans? What are they going to think? So that would be great. I should have flipped this around. I didn't mean to end on a downer, but I also do have some worries. I have some worries. It's not all great. For example, I do predict a greater decrease, a loss of community, or what we call a decrease in social capital. A lot of studies show that secular Americans, or secular humans, in fact, on average, just an average, it's not all, but on average, tend to be more individualistic than their religious counterparts. They tend to place less value on being part of a like-minded group. They tend to not be interested in affiliating with other secular folks. In fact, one anthropologist, Frank Pasquale, estimates that only somewhere between 2 and 5% of secular people are even interested in affiliating with a secular organization. You are total outliers, like extreme. So there is and with we see so many benefits to social capital, right? Communities with high rates of social capital experience that people tend to be healthier on average, they tend to live longer on average, they tend to be more generous on average, and cultures with decreased social capital tend to have higher suicide rates, higher crime rates. So this kind of, we are social animals, and we've evolved that way, and so this higher degree of individualism and individualization, and I don't know what's causing what. Is it increased individualism causing secularity? Is increased secularity causing increased individualism? Are they both? Is it a spurious relationship? They're both being caused by some third factor, like increased education, or the internet is responsible for everything. It's hard to say. But this increased individualism, I do worry about as to kind of what social pathologies it may breed. Maybe not. Maybe not. And then finally, what about rituals, traditions, and heritage? Now, most diehard secular folks hear those words and I remember one time going to a Unitarian Universalist church, and they asked me to speak there, but I went for the whole service, and I loved it. It was a warm and fun feeling. The songs were about like morning dew on the blades of grass, and I came home and I said to my wife, that was really nice. And she said, well, why? And I said, well, it's not, they didn't emphasize God at all. It's just really about the community. I said, maybe we should check out the Unitarian Universalist. She said, well, why would we do that? And I said, I don't know, just to get together with people, have that sense of belonging and community. And she just looked at me and she was like, community. So, yuck, So, and in fact, my wife's a good example. She's actually more secular than I am in the sense that I'm obsessed with secularity. I'm obsessed with religion. I click the religion page on Huffington Post every day, My wife wouldn't think to do that. My wife is so secular that she doesn't really think about religion unless it's in her face, and she certainly doesn't think about being secular unless I bring it up at the dinner table. So it's just, you know, and she would never think to affiliate on the basis of being secular. She has her interests in modern dance and design and architecture. She spends her weekends building Danish modern couches. And that's where she finds a sense of purpose and meaning. And that's, you know, you have to ask yourself, what is more secular? This gathering or the folks at Pitzer College building furniture right now? Which is actually more secular? Here we are talking about secularity and religiosity. They're building furniture. And religion's not even on the agenda or the menu at all, even if to debunk it or critique it. Anyway, so with that, though, not just the community, or again, rituals, traditions, and heritage, and if anybody has ever taken an anthropology class or just looked around, these things seem to be intrinsically important to humans. Passages in life, marking the passage of time in a meaningful way that links you to your descendants and ancestors, that feeling of doing some act that you know your great-great-grandparents did and hopefully your great-great-grandchildren will do, that notion of doing something that feels sacred, that feels profound, that is beyond just mundane everyday life. Humans seem to thrive. They need that. Not all of us, maybe not my wife, but most humans seem to want those kind of rituals, want those traditions, and want to feel a sense of heritage that is hard to create out of thin air. It's hard to establish. I often notice that the Scandinavians, who are among the most secular folks in the world, still have this sort of Lutheran heritage. They don't believe in God, they don't believe in the Bible, they don't believe in Jesus, but darn it if they don't enjoy Christmas evening and enjoy Easter because it's rooted in something. That they know they eat the same meal, they sing the same songs, they light the same candles that they've been doing for centuries. And it's hard to create that out of scratch, right? Most Jews in the world, right, don't believe, but darn it if they don't have this sense of belonging, which involves holidays and rituals and memories that is somehow really not, it's not theistic, and it's not fully religious, it's kind of cultural, but it's tied somehow together. And I wonder how we're going to do that. We're trying now. Sunday assemblies, humanist gatherings, humanist groups, whether it's for coffee or for beer or something like this. And yet, right, there's nobody under 10 here, right? There's nobody under, is there anybody under 18 here? And that's important. When I go to these things and others who, or yourselves, your speakers, do you see kids? Do you see families? If you don't, you have to wonder, is this really creating a heritage? And maybe that's not what we want. I mean, most secular people don't want that, right? They're not looking to recreate some kind of religious heritage or something akin to. But I do ponder this a lot, more and more, as I raise my children, and I'm raising my kids more and more secularly. My oldest daughter kind of was a bit more Jewish. My third son, I'm just like, I've become more and more secular. But it's interesting to see how that's affecting him and the kind of things we do or don't do anymore and what's replacing it. And I'll end here in conclusion that, religion clearly provides a lot of things to people, from morals and ethics, so to speak, to community, to rituals, to dealing with death, to coping with hard times. But now we're seeing more and more and more people saying they're living their lives without it. So how are they getting those things? How do they deal with death? How do they impart morals and ethics and values to their children? How do they develop a sense of belonging? How do they find community? How do they cope when they have breast cancer? How do they experience a feeling of transcendence, perhaps, or joy or awe? And that is what I wrote about. That's what sort of the heart of my latest book was, sort of looking at not arguing for secularism in a sort of polemic, but trying to ask, okay, more and more people are saying they're living their lives without religion. How's that going? How's it working? And it's actually working extremely well, despite my concerns voiced here. Thank you for listening. I appreciate it. So, thank you. Yeah. Thanks for the whistle. Thank you. Thank you for that. So do I stay here for the Q&A? Okay, thank you for that.
If you want to know where you can get all that great data, so you can throw it out at those cocktail parties, right here.
It's true.
After the Q&A, get it signed here at the podium. A couple thoughts on the internet, the role of the internet. If you haven't seen the HBO film Going Clear about Scientology, they keep repeating it. It's all over the internet, so you can watch it. But one of the great moments is when the film producer, director, Paul Haggis, recounts the story when he first heard about the theological origin story of Scientology, about the galactic warrior Xenu, who brings all these earthly or these humans to peg the Earth and DC-9 airplanes in space and all this stuff, and he says, "What the fuck are you talking about?" And he goes, "Oh, wait a minute, this is a test of my gullibility, right?" Well, he had to pay however much money to get up to the higher levels of OT to hear the story before he heard the story. Now it's all over the internet, it's on South Park and so on. And then anyway, I'll start us off with the first question. So at this debate that I did this week with Frank Turek, I brought up the problem of evil. Why don't you believe in God? One of them is the problem of evil. Not why are there wars or genocides, because their answer to that is, well, God gave us free will and people choose to do bad things. Now, why would God allow innocent children to die of leukemia? I mean, this is a tiny little girl, she dies miserably, terrible, the family's shattered, and just what's the good of that? Don't give me the God works in mysterious ways. Anyway, afterwards, a woman came up and said, well, this happened to me. My daughter died 18 months ago of leukemia, and so on, and I can tell you, I know she's with Jesus right now. I know with 100% certainty. She's where she belongs. She's with God. It's infinite love and joy and so on. What do you say? I'm sorry. This happened. But if you're asking me from a scientist's perspective, I presume you pray for her, because most people do pray for their loved ones who are sick. And, oh yes, and sometimes they get better, and God gets the credit for that. She goes, yes, He works miracles. How come He didn't work a miracle for you? That would be my question. Because she didn't want to say it in mysterious ways, but that was the answer. I'll find out when I get there and I'm rejoining with my daughter. There it is. And what do we have to say? What would you say in that situation? And then we'll turn it over for questions. Well, that's a hard one.
No, it is. I've interviewed a lot of people. I've interviewed people who have had their children die at young ages. I read about a woman in the book who lost a son to leukemia at age 4. She was an atheist at the time and remained an atheist afterwards. Me personally, if I met this woman, I'd probably just have nothing but, I'm so sorry for your loss, and that's awesome that he's with Jesus, and that's grand. I mean, I'm just not the kind of, I would just feel like it would be too, I like the way you posed it, like, well, that would be my question, to be sure. I once interviewed a young man, check this one out. He was a Christian, he was a senior in high school, and he loved the Lord so much, and he loved Jesus so much, and he wanted to be the best Christian he could, and there was a children's hospital in the town where he lived. And so he thought, well, it's not just prayer, I have to do stuff to make, to be a good Christian. So he decided to raise money for the children's hospital. I mean, they weren't asking for it, but that's just what it seemed to him a good Christian would do. And he went around door to door, he went to organizations, he went to businesses, he went to people. He raised $33,000 as a 17-year-old kid for this children's hospital. And he gave it to that children's hospital. And they were so touched. I mean, wow, okay, that's fantastic. So they wanted to give him, have a dinner in his honor to thank him. And they invited his parents and the school principal and a few others and his pastor, and to have a little banquet and just, give him a little certificate and thank this young man for raising $33,000 for the children's hospital. Well, he had never actually been in the children's hospital. So he got a tour. He was an atheist within a week. And that's rare. That's rare. Most people, it takes 3 to 5 years to lose their faith on average. People struggle, they go through. It's very rare for people to. He said he toured the hospital and actually met children dying and was so devastated by the pain and suffering. I think it was Mark Twain, too, who said, you could disabuse a Christian by just giving him a tour of the children's ward at any hospital. Yeah, the problem of evil, absolutely. But you know what? And this may be totally silly, but this proves I never stopped being a freshman in college. And I just wrote my latest blog on Psychology Today on this so you can see all the data. But I'm always I was on the Dennis Prager show recently, and they're always saying, how can you believe in humans after this bloody 20th century? look at all the horror, and you had to deal with this in your latest book, as did Steven Pinker in his, and it was like The Better Angels of Nature. I mean, look at Hiroshima, Nagasaki, World War I, World War II, Vietnam, Cambodia, El Salvador, the Holocaust, the Armenian genocide, etc. I mean, how can you possibly believe in the goodness of humans after this horrific 20th century? And I thought, yeah, and we have all the answers, but I was like, I wonder how God fared in the 20th century. So I found all this data on what caused how many deaths in the 20th century. 6 million died by snake bites alone between 1900 and 2000. Malaria and tuberculosis killed far more people than all genocides combined in the 20th century. You just tally up the Armenian, the Cambodian, the Jewish, the Ukrainian famine, you name it. And just malaria and tuberculosis alone. Smallpox killed more humans. Smallpox, I mean, what a horrible way to die. I mean, not that I want to ponder this tonight, like would I rather be shot in the jungles of Cambodia or die from smallpox? I might prefer getting shot, right? And so I thought, well, why don't we say, how can you believe God after all the people he killed in the 20th century? We said he gets off scot-free. So I don't know. I think to me the problem of evil, the problem of evil is indeed one of the, I mean, the only response though is that doesn't prove God doesn't exist. It just proves he's a asshole. It's just, I mean, and William Lane Craig says this all the time, and others have said, well, we just, yes, it's suffering, but we just have to assume God has a better plan for these people or whatnot. So I totally agree, but me personally, but what's interesting to me is the way these tragedies, and I'll stop pontificating, I know I've had my time, but in interviewing people who have lost their faith, you often hear stories about tragedy causes them to question their faith, but clearly that's a minority. I mean, if tragedy caused people to lose their faith, there would be no, religion would have stopped existing 30,000 years ago. I mean, if everybody who lost a mother to breast cancer or a child to leukemia or a brother to a drunk driver or whatever, we would have stopped. So clearly most humans find comfort in the face of tragedy, and they don't think about, I remember interviewing a woman who explained, well, she went to the doctor and her breast cancer was discovered early and she had the great health insurance and a great doctor, so God was blessing her by saving her from her breast cancer. And I'm like, but why did you have breast cancer in the first place? I mean, what the hell? But I didn't say that. I said, I'm so happy for you. That's awesome. And the reconstructive surgery is fantastic. Okay, so in the way back, I saw yours first, very eager hand, and then we'll go. Yes? Oh.
Second, language is important. And for the people that check the box that they don't believe in God, they have refused to identify as an atheist. I personally don't call myself an atheist because I'm not also have to say I'm an Easter bunny or a tooth fairy.
Indeed. Indeed.
Too many to choose from. But there are other terms like free thinker or right, but they sound kind of intellectual. I personally prefer the term humanist because A, it addresses one issue, it makes me part of a group. And B, I think it'd be hard for a religious person to say, well, I'm anti-humanist.
Oh, that's a good one.
And also, if they accuse you of being an atheist, you could say, well, which one?
Right.
My question is there a particular term that you prefer or promote?
Yeah. It always depends on the context, on who I'm with. So if I want to be really, if I want to really be strong and sting somebody, not sting them, but be very upfront about it, I'll say I'm an atheist. I'm also agnostic on, where did we come from? How did the universe begin? What, time, space, these things don't, are beyond my ability to understand. So I'll often say agnostic sometimes, but I do prefer secular humanist if I had to pick one. It's not perfect, it doesn't capture everything, but what does, right? So I'll often say I think humanist is my general favorite. Again, it asserts where I do put my hope, in the good potential of humans to solve problems through their creativity, compassion, intelligence, reason, et cetera, et cetera. So I like humanist or secular humanist. Problem with it is, I've talked to many people who said a lot of secular parents, one thing you find is they worry about how to raise their kids, and and I don't mean secular folks like you. I mean secular folks who are not affiliated with groups and don't, just your average non-religious person. They will say to me, I don't want my kids to be nothing. I'm worried. The neighbor down the street is Methodist, and then his best friend is Catholic, and the kids, I don't want my kids to be nothing. And I'll say, well, how about secular humanist? And they'll look at me and say, what the hell's that? And I'll say, good point, good point. We have to get the word out. We have to make it another legitimate thing to be. And maybe even we'll have some great humanist community centers and whatnot. Okay, here, and then any women in the audience want to ask a question? Anybody? Yes, and then right here. So you first, and then there. Yes?
I was speaking to an author yesterday at the book fair. His hypothesis was that one of the main reasons that America has not become as secular as Europe is that Europe teaches history and comparative religion in school from an early age, and we have virtually no religious education on any kind. I mean, some of it shows up in history, but there's no concentrated effort of teaching, particularly comparative religion.
Yeah.
What are your opinions about that?
Yeah, I lived in Scandinavia for 2 years. They had very clear chunks of the curriculum devoted to comparative religion. I was in Denmark for 2 years, and my kids were in school. And absolutely, they did a section on Islam, and a section on Christianity, a section on Judaism, and Hinduism, Buddhism. I looked at the textbooks even. And I think having curriculum on on comparative religion is essential. Not because I think it may secularize students, which it might, but that's not my agenda. I mean, the agenda is just understanding the world. And it may have the effect of secularizing students as well. It seems to be the case that many people who have lost their faith talk about learning about other religions as part of that, to be sure. Yes, sir?
Thank you. I want to thank you for your talk.
Thank you.
Bring up the word atheism. I've heard it mentioned a lot. But history uses the term atheism.
Huh.
And it's something that I've started to really think a lot about myself, because I was raised with a religious background. And I have a son who, in spite of like a lot of my worries, is doing really well at the college level. Although he went to a private school. He was Christian. That's it. And I would not have preferred to put him in that. But his mother was very
Okay.
But I'm not. But I noticed that there's a quality of education that he got that, I'm worried about a lot of the schools. Public schools go big. I'll spend that money and then roll the dice, and maybe he'll learn something and be able to, sort of differentiate. I like that idea of being taught comparatively.
Yeah.
A Christian school in the United States, you're not going to really get like
Yeah. Yeah.
politicians,
For sure.
label. What do you have to say about those two terms, first of all, atheist versus atheist? If you can speak on that. Is there a placebo also? Because
Man.
a child will need comfort.
Yeah.
You're just trying to tell them how scary this world is.
Yeah.
I've been able to learn. I've been able to survive a lot of this.
Yeah.
The onslaught of religion. And why we're, I don't want to pull that card that I could pull, but
Right.
Certain people that were brought into this country weren't allowed to read only one book, the Bible.
Well, I guess, yeah, there's a lot. Yeah, there's a lot there.
Atheist versus atheist, and what's the solution?
Whew. Man, a lot there. I'm going to say two things, maybe three. Number one, in almost every gathering like this, whether it's Center for Inquiry in Hollywood, or this, or FFRF, or American Humanist Association, at the end of almost every talk, and I don't know if others have had this experience, there's always a discussion on what we should label ourselves. Every time. What term do your question is every time. What do we make of that? It's saying something about where we're at, and how important identity is, and how important language is, and designating what it is we're all about. So I'm just going to make that observation. Atheist, atheist, it's, I like humanist, but everybody has a right to label themselves however they feel most comfortable. You did say something that I do need to remark about. I have a whole chapter on raising kids. Yes, I throw in a few anecdotes there to make my publisher happy, but the bulk of the chapter is about what findings I could unearth that look at how secular kids raised in secular homes are faring. They're faring extremely well. Now, about 11% of children in America are raised with no religion. That's incredible. If you think about the percentages of other, African Americans make up about 12% of the United States, right? So if 11% of Americans say they grew up in secular homes, that's amazing. And we're finding all kinds of strong correlations with the values these children are taught, their success in school, their success in resisting peer pressure, et cetera, et cetera. And in fact, now this is going to sound like I'm tooting my own horn. It's not, or maybe it is, but I just think it says something. I wrote an op-ed piece for the LA Times a few months ago. And it just, in 750 words, I tried to summarize the findings of this research that shows that secular kids, on a host of variables and indicators, do quite well, in many instances better than religious kids. It's had over 1.5 million views, and the LA Times said it's been the most read op-ed piece they've had in over 7 years. They invited me to the office. The head guy came out and shook my hand. Pat Morrison had me on her show. They were thrilled. It was shared by so many people. It's called, I think they gave it a different title, like How Do Secular Families Stack Up or something like that. And it just went crazy. So I'm not trying to sit here and say, look how awesome I am. It's the only op-ed piece I've had on the LA Times. It's my first and only one. But what I'm saying is the fact that it was the most read op-ed piece they've had in over 7 years says that this is clearly important to lots of people. And everybody was sharing it, and everybody was sending it to friends and family on email and Facebook and Twitter, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm quite, despite what I said at the end of my talk about, individualism and what we're going to do about family and heritage, clearly children raised in secular homes have strong moral compasses. They are taught to think for themselves. They're taught to question authority. They're taught not, in fact, there's some studies where, these psychological studies, social psychology, where they ask parents what kind of traits they want to see in their children. What kind of characteristics do they try to cultivate in their kids? And they're given lists, 30, 40, 50 options. And the more secular the parent, the higher up the list goes thinking for oneself as the number one quality or trait they want to cultivate or see in their children. And the more religious the parents get, the higher up the list, and often number one is obedience. This is fascinating. This is really important actually for a healthy democracy. I mean, a healthy democracy requires people who think for themselves, question authority, right? And a democracy does not fare well with a bunch of obedient people. That's usually the other end of the political spectrum. So I just, all kinds, both single and two-parent. Okay, you had a question there. And I'm just going to keep going until Dr. Shermer cuts me off. Yes?
Talking about at the very beginning, especially with the members of people that say none. How do you filter in or account for people that may have been secular or have secular views for a long time, but are just now admitting it?
How do we account for people that may have had a secular worldview or lacked supernatural beliefs the whole time, but are only now just admitting it? Is that? Right. Yeah. Can I tell a quick anecdote? I don't know, about 10 years ago, I went in for a vasectomy. And when I'm registering at the hospital, they ask, they ask you all these questions like the day before your surgery so that when you come for your surgery, you can just be whisked in. And I remember the woman at the computer said, she's asking me all these questions, insurance questions, blah, blah. And then finally she says, what would you like me to put down for religion? And I scratched my head and it's a trouble, and I said, atheist. And she looked at her computer screen and was just like, excuse me? I said, non-religious. Oh, I can't go to I don't know how to, I can't go to the next room. So I kind of said, well, what's this for? And she said, well, if your vasectomy goes awry and you're dying, we can call, who do we call? I said, wow, that's an ugly thought. And I said, okay, I'll say Jewish. And that's always difficult for me because I identify as a Jew culturally. So if someone asks me what's my religion and Jews on the list, I'm often tempted to tick that kind of in a kind of, I don't know, identity sense or preserving my people or just, I don't know why. But in that case, I said Jewish and she said, oh, thank goodness. Okay, they clicked Jewish again. So she was really, about a month ago, I was really sick and I was again having to go to the hospital. And first time I'd been that sick in my whole life. And I was met with the same experience, and the woman's asking me all these questions, and then she says, religious identification? And I said, no religion, atheist. And she went, tick, next question. This is the same medical group, the same insurance, the same hospital. So clearly something's going on with more and more people coming out and saying, I don't want to pick one of these options. Have people who harbored those feelings but may not have wanted to say it in the past, are they more likely to say it now? Absolutely. There's no question. There's still a stigma. You're all familiar with the surveys that show atheists are the least, Americans are the least comfortable in having an atheist president. They're the least comfortable in having when presented with other minority groups and other options and other religions. They're the least likely to want their children to marry an atheist as opposed to a Muslim or a Jew or a Baptist or a Catholic or a Quaker or a Mormon or said blah, blah, blah. And yet, despite the fact that there still is in the United States that stigma to being an atheist, more and more Americans, I think, are just simply now more comfortable saying it. Do I have any hard numbers there? I don't. It's a great question. But my sense is that it's just becoming more. Look, the fact that when President Obama was inaugurated for the first time back in 2008, was it? 9? So at his inaugurational speech, in Washington, D.C., right there in our nation's capital with everybody watching, he said, we are a nation of Buddhists and Jews and Christians and Muslims and non-believers. No president had ever included that in a list in such a public, I mean, this is his inauguration. He could have said that at a speech at NYU on his, or whatever. This was the inauguration. So the fact that the president was willing to say that and able to say that tells us two things. It tells us, number one, his speechwriters said, we better include that because it's a growing demographic and we want them on it, They knew that, right? And then it has the other effect of people saying, hey, if the president can acknowledge me, maybe I can acknowledge myself. So I'm absolutely certain that more people who 20 years ago, 15 years ago, certainly 35 years ago, would just keep Lutheran, Catholic, whatever, Episcopalian, now are more comfortable saying none. Clearly, the data is, there. Right here?
Quick question. What are your thoughts about developing a secular calendar to celebrate secular achievement as opposed to what
Man. Yes. Auguste Comte, the man who coined the term sociology, Frenchman, ex-Catholic, became an atheist, free thinker, did just that. He created a secular calendar, and he replaced all the religious holidays with secular versions, and all the saints with secular saints. Another important individual who did this was Joseph Stalin. He did it. He did. They just repurposed all the holidays, made them communist. The same dates, the same day, but they even repurposed. Instead of Santa Claus, they created, I don't know, Max Publicum or something. So I am not too comfortable doing that in a kind of official way. I'm very comfortable with people doing that in their own personal lives. So I'll give you an example. I interviewed a couple up in the Northwest who absolutely did not want to celebrate Christmas for various reasons. They just did not want to poison their daughter with the consumerism and the theology. But as she started to get 4 or 5 years old, again, that worry sets in. Secular parents had this great worry. Are we depriving our child of something? Are we making a mistake? So they reached a compromise. They were going to celebrate the solstice, which was near Christmas. And they decided, well, what we'll do is we'll wake her up at 5 in the morning. We'll bake some great, rolls and bread, and we'll bake some coffee and some hot chocolate. And we'll drive up the mountain nearby in our home in Portland. And we'll just watch the sunrise, and we'll give her a single present. So nothing over the top. And so they told her, we're going to be doing this now. So they created a kind of secular alternative. But the great part about it was they drove up to the mountain. This is about 8 or 9 years ago. And they parked the car at this park. It's 5 in the morning. And there's about 7 other cars parked there. And they're thinking, well, this is weird. Are these people that, homeless people, but the cars didn't look that way? Is this a drug deal? Like, what the hell? And then as soon as the sun started to rise, all these parents got out with their little kids, and they were all there to celebrate the winter solstice. They all talked to each other. They exchanged numbers and emails and made it a ritual. Now they all have raised their kids celebrating this. So I do believe there can be secular alternatives, but they have to be organic. I myself wouldn't be down with sort of creating this official, secular calendar. So,
one last question. What's the gender ratio for nuns and atheists?
We have all that data. I wrote a blog about that on The Friendly Atheist in response to Greta Christina's concerns. Worldwide, whether we're talking Uzbekistan or California, Far and away, I shouldn't say far and away, it's always about 20 percentage points, almost always, somewhere between 18, 22%. Men are far more likely to identify as secular or none, far more likely, 20% more likely than women. It's not, there's one or two countries where it's not that way, but the vast majority it is. When you specifically get into atheist, it gets, do you identify as an atheist? Do you take that label? It gets even more. So it might be like 69% of Americans who identify as atheist are male. When it gets to agnostic, it's something like 75. So there's something going on in terms of who feels most comfortable identifying. I have a whole lecture on why we see this disparity, psychological aspects, sociological aspects, neurological aspects, and also just aspects of power and privilege, and so on and so forth. So we do see these differences, but I expect those differences to shrink in the decades ahead, for sure.
Again, all this data is in here. Get your book here. Get it signed here. Thank you, Dr.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks.
Where are you going to hang out?
I guess